Hello again, and happy and blessed third weekend of September 2023 from Metro Manila in the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. Almost exactly 50 years ago, or on October the 6th, 1973, began the Yom Kippur War, named after the Yom Kippur, or the Great Day of Atonement, which is the holiest day of the Jewish religious calendar, between Egypt, Israel's western and southwestern neighbor, and Syria, Israel's northeastern neighbor. At issue was those two Arab nations or countries' desire to win back the territories that they had lost to Israel as a result of the 6 Days War back in June 1967, when Israel had occupied from Egypt the Gaza Strip and even the Sinai Peninsula and Egypt's other easternmost territories, all the way up to the east bank or eastern shore of the Suez Canal, that man made canal which since 1869 has united the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea and has reduced the sailing distance between Europe and Asia, especially southern and eastern Asia, by one half, because those ships no longer will have to sail around the long western and southern and southeastern coasts of Africa. And then Syria had lost the Golan Heights to Israel. There were some or several other Arab nations involved, such as Morocco and Jordan, I think also Libya, that supplied arms, that is, weapons and troops to Egypt and Syria, but were not directly attacking Israel by themselves. Apparently, Egypt's new president, Anwar el-Sadat, who had taken office after the sudden death due to a heart attack of his predecessor, Gamal Abdel Nasser, in September 1970, would have been willing to negotiate the peaceful return to Egypt of the Sinai Peninsula. But he insisted that the United States and the Soviet Union, two of the world's three superpowers at that time, would act as the mediators of those negotiations. However, Israel's first and so far only official female Prime Minister, Mrs. Golda Meir, refused that kind of mediation offer and wanted instead direct negotiations, bilateral negotiations involving only Egypt and Israel. So both Egypt and Syria had authoritarian, if not autocratic, presidents, Anwar el-Sadat and Hafez al-Assad, and already twice in 1973, prior to the October 1973 attack, that is in May and August 1973, Egypt had staged so huge military exercises on the western bank or shore of the Suez Canal that Israel had both times called up many of its reserve units. And for Israel's small national economy, despite the fact that on a per capita basis, Israel was probably already considerably more prosperous than Egypt at the time, this placed a heavy strain. And unfortunately, too many of Israel's prominent politicians, including Prime Minister Meir, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, despite his long military background, and then at least some or several of Israel's high-ranking army officers believed, or at least hoped, that there would be no war either during the summer or the autumn of 1973. As Sir Martin Gilbert, a late British Jewish historian, explained in his book, A History of Israel, published in the late 1990s, when Yitzhak Rabin himself, a former professional soldier turned diplomat and then politician, returned to Israel from his ambassadorship in the United States during the spring of 1973, he found many Israeli Jews to be quite complacent and even condescending in their attitudes towards the neighboring Arab countries. After all, Israel had miraculously defeated several other Arab countries, and quickly too, during the Six Days War in early June 1967. Many Bible believing Christians believed this to be part of the divine intervention, that God would protect his chosen people. And then during September 1973, the German Jewish born Henry Kissinger, or Kissinger, who was then serving as the US Secretary of State or Foreign Minister, kept repeating to Mr. Simcha Diniz, who was the new Israeli ambassador to the United States, don't preempt. In other words, don't attack first, or otherwise the Americans would not give any military or material aid to the Israelites, or Israelis rather. Besides, during September 1973, Prime Minister Meir visited Austria, a country in Central Europe, which, by the way, was neutral at the time, and Austria, who was effectively governed under the parliamentary democratic system, by Federal Chancellor or Prime Minister Bruno Kreisky, a social democrat who was also of Jewish background, although religiously he was an agnostic. In other words, he doubted if there is a God. And Federal Chancellor Kreisky had a brother living in Israel, but he refused, if I remember correctly, to provide transit visas to more Jewish refugees from the former, that time's Soviet Union and/or Eastern European countries via Austria, in order for them to make the Aliyah or move to Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel. And then by the early days of October 1973, at least several or many agents of the Israeli army's intelligence service, Mossad, were becoming notably concerned or even alarmed by the obvious signs of military troop buildup along the western shore of the Suez Canal in eastern Egypt and near the Golan Heights in southwestern Syria. And finally, on the morning of October the 6th, 1973, several hours before the attack actually happened, a few or some of the military officers of Israel, or of the military intelligence officers, met Prime Minister Meir and advised her privately that towards the sunset, so around 5 or 6 p.m. that day, the Egyptians and the Syrians would invade Israel. And as a compromise measure, and they missed it actually by 3 to 4 hours, because the attack, the joint Egyptian and Syrian attack on Israel, already began at 2 o'clock that afternoon. When anyway, as a compromise measure, Prime Minister Meir ordered the calling to active service of 100,000 soldiers of the Israeli military reserves. So in multiple synagogues or Jewish places of worship throughout Israel, many of the reserve soldiers who went to the synagogues to pray on Yom Kippur were handed their call-up or active duty papers, or mobilization papers, yes. So what happened? At 2 p.m., many airplanes of the Egyptian Air Force flew over the Suez Canal, bombing the Israeli positions of the eastern bank, and then huge solid water cannons were able to blast holes in the Israeli sandbanks on the eastern shore of the Suez Canal. Outnumbered, the Israeli defenders did fight bravely, but were forced in several places on the eastern shore of the Suez Canal to surrender. While then uh, Syrian forces attacked the Golan Heights. During the first few days of that 3-week war, it lasted from October the 6th to October the 26th, 1973, with the ceasefire coming into effect officially on October the 23rd. So for the first few days of that 3-week war, the Egyptians and Syrians were able to advance considerably. The Egyptians into the eastern bank of the Golan Heights, eastern bank of the Suez Canal, and the Syrians into the Golan Heights. However, then the Israelis or Israeli Jews were able to fight back and gradually push the Egyptians back towards the eastern shore of the Suez Canal and the Syrians back towards southwestern Syria. With the result that eventually uh, the Americans and Soviets, who had come close to the brink of an actual military conflict, which in the worst case scenario would have caused World War III and the nuclear war to break up. They also mediated, and so the warring parties agreed to a ceasefire or agreed to stop all fighting by October the 26th, 1973. Immediately after the war had begun, the Arab oil-producing nations dominated Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries spiked the price of crude oil by 70%, which caused a massive inflation and notable oil shortages and energy shortages in many Western European countries, but also in North America, that is Canada, the United States, and to some extent in Australia and New Zealand, but also in numerous other countries. And this action, which came with little or no warning, caused the first oil crisis to break out. So this was in retaliation to the material aid that many Western countries had generously given to Israel during the early days of the war, but then most Western European countries stopped their aid in order not to anger the oil-producing Arab countries more. So the consequences were some 2,700 Israeli soldiers died. This was at least 3 times more, maybe 4, or between 3 and 4 times more than had been killed during the Six-Day War over 6 years earlier. Some 8,500 Egyptians and Syrians were killed. This is a rough estimate, of whom over 6,000 were Egyptian soldiers. All 3 actively fighting countries had prisoners of war. Although Israel had won a defensive military victory, many ordinary Israelis were understandably outraged at the complacent attitudes of many of their, or even most of their political and military leaders. And they demanded justice. They demanded that those people who were responsible for the humiliating early defeats that Israel had suffered would have to pay the consequences and step down from their positions. And indeed, the report that was published, I think in early April 1974, was devastating. Although it blamed the early heavy Israeli defeats mostly on the army, it did lay a portion of the blame on Prime Minister Meir and Defense Minister Dayan. So Meir drew the conclusions from that report and decided to take personal responsibility, political responsibility for her errors. by indicating that she would resign, and in June 1974 she was replaced by Yitzhak Rabin as the Israeli prime minister. Also, Defense Minister Dayan resigned. In Egypt, temporarily, President Anwar el-Sadat became more popular because at least Egypt had advanced considerably on the Israeli into the Israeli front lines during the first few days of the war. However, Egypt had ended up suffering a defeat. It was already its fourth defeat to Israel in 25 years. The first one of those defeats took place during the 1948 to 1949 Israeli Independence War. The second one during the short Suez Canal War at the end of October and at the start of November 1956, when Britain, France, and Israel had attacked the Suez Canal in order to force the autocratic Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser to reopen the Suez Canal to the international cargo ships. And then obviously the third defeat had been suffered during the Six-Day War in June 1967, and then the fourth one during the Yom Kippur War of October 1973. Interestingly enough, in October 1977, President el-Sadat flew to Israel and spoke to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, proclaiming his desire to negotiate a peace treaty with Israel, and indeed he did. Those negotiations took place for the most part in the main U.S. presidential retreat or holiday home, Camp David in Maryland. In September 1978, they were chaired by then U.S. President Jimmy Carter, and tentatively in September 1978 and definitively in March 1979, the Camp David peace accords were signed by Presidents Carter and el-Sadat and by Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who in June 1977 had succeeded Yitzhak Rabin as the new Israeli Prime Minister. Contrary to Rabin, who was a Labour or center-left politician, Begin was a conservative politician of the Likud party or coalition. And in or around December 1978, Begin and el-Sadat shared the Nobel Peace Prize between them. However, for all those three leaders, the Camp David peace accords became quite costly, although not all of them suffered directly because of it. The most direct sufferer was President el-Sadat, because Egypt was effectively suspended or fired from the Arab League, one of the most important political organizations of the Arab Muslim countries, until 1989. And Sadat himself was assassinated by a group of fanatical extremist Islamic soldiers who had infiltrated the Egyptian army during military parade to commemorate the 8th anniversary of the start of the Yom Kippur War on October the 6th, 1981. What happened was that these fanatical soldiers forced the driver of a military jeep of the parade to stop, and then they jumped out of the jeep and started to run towards an open-air stand where there were tens of dignitaries, politicians, army officers, and diplomats. Tragically and fatally, President el-Sadat thought that this running towards the open-air stand was some sort of a demonstration of loyalty, and he rose from his seat on the balcony instead of diving for cover. So this made him a ready target, and no wonder he was hit by those fatal bullets almost immediately. He collapsed on the stand in a pool of blood, and despite being rushed to the nearest hospital, he died of his wounds later that day. Vice President Hosni Mubarak was injured but recovered, and he was appointed as the next Egyptian president, and he would hold office for almost 30 years before being forced to resign by the first wave of the Arab Spring revolts in February 2011. As for Begin, he managed to get narrowly re-elected in June 1948, despite a huge upsurge in the labor alignment support. However, the Operation Peace in Galilee, uh, a border region war between Israel, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and Lebanon, which already had been torn apart by a civil war since 1975, which would last until 1990 or 1991, um, proved disastrous politically for Begin because he was indirectly blamed, as were a number of Israeli army officers, such as General and possibly Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, for the massacre of numerous civilians in the villages of Sabra and Shatila near Beirut. Um, and then in November 1982, Begin's beloved wife, Eliza, passed away, and the loss of his beloved wife made Begin understandably deeply depressed. He eventually resigned as the Israeli prime minister in October 1983, and until only a few days before his death, when he fought for his earthly life in a hospital in Jerusalem, he lived in semi-seclusion inside his apartment in Jerusalem, receiving few visitors, taking almost no phone calls, reading books, listening to British Broadcasting Corporation uh, news, and watching news broadcasts and movies. Former Prime Minister Begin would rarely leave his apartment, and when he did, he mostly made pilgrimages to the grave of his late wife, Eliza, on the anniversary of the latter's death, and recited with his children the Jewish prayer for the dead, Kaddish. As for President Carter, tragically, in November 1979, in retaliation at Carter's reluctant decision to let the deposed autocratic Iranian Shah, that is King and Emperor Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, seek medical treatment in the United States because of the cancer that would kill the Shah in Egypt in July 1980. A group of fanatical Islamic Iranians stormed the US Embassy in Tehran, Iran's capital, and took all of its personnel as hostages, although they freed some or several of them uh, some months later or some weeks later. Unfortunately, the hostages were held as prisoners inside the US Embassy for 1 year, 2.5 months, until January the 20th, 1981, the very day when Ronald Reagan, the Republican presidential candidate who had easily defeated Carter in the November 1980 US presidential elections, succeeded Carter as the US president. And at least several historians are of the opinion that had Carter managed to bring the American hostages home to the United States before the November 1980 US presidential elections, despite his multiple, especially domestic failures, he would probably have been re-elected. But this didn't happen, and the rest is history. So the Camp David peace accords did not bring any direct long-term, positive long-term benefits for any of the three signatories. Tragically, Prime Minister Rabin would be assassinated by a fanatical Israeli Jew named Yigal Amir just after leaving a peace rally in Tel Aviv in November 1995. So, as the 50th anniversary of this tragic war draws near, obviously the Israeli army has tightened security measures. Okay, I'm going to read some summaries of several articles. JC Reporter, that's a news website, published on September the 14th, 2023. One of Israel's greatest tests came as Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on the Day of Atonement. Yes, I should have said, I told you, dear listeners or viewers, that by the Camp David peace accords, Egypt recognized Israel as as an independent country, and um, signed diplomatic relations or created diplomatic relations with it. Um, and some cultural exchanges were made, but for many years, the Israeli Egyptian relations were what Sir Martin Gilbert, in his historical book about Israel, 20th century Israel mostly, a so called cold peace. Yes, they were at peace. Yes, they recognized each other as legitimate and independent countries, but they didn't have close relations. So Egypt became, under the Camp David peace accords, the first Arab country to officially recognize Israel. So at 2 p.m. on October the 6th, 1973, as millions of Israelis prayed and fasted while observing Yom Kippur, Egypt and Syria launched a massive attack across the Suez Canal into the Sinai Desert and in the Golan Heights. And unfortunately, the two-pronged offensive came as a total surprise for most Israelis, including several cabinet ministers of the government of Prime Minister Golda Meir, and many of the even top officers of the Israeli army. Although there had been military exercises, especially by Egypt earlier in 1973, uh, there was a general failure at the highest political and military decision making levels to take those military exercises seriously enough. And the heavily outnumbered Israelis were negatively surprised by how professional and courageous the Egyptian and Syrian armies were, and did suffer heavy losses before being able to um, win a series of defensive victories. While Egypt lost more territory and also suffered appalling losses, the long term outcome was recognition of Israel. The return of the Sinai Peninsula under the Camp David peace accords. So peacefully, the Israelis withdrew from that peninsula by 1982, and a peace with Israel that has lasted until this day. Unfortunately, Syria has never signed a peace treaty with Israel until now. The détente, a new series of steps towards a peaceful coexistence between the two main superpowers of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union, and many of their allies, and also many neutral and non-aligned countries, did suffer temporarily, although less than 2 years after the war, at the end of July and at the start of August 1975 in Helsinki, Finland, Northern Europe. I'm from Finland, by the way. Um, the heads of state or heads of government of almost all of the European countries at that time, and then the Soviet dictator, General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, Mr. Leonid Brezhnev, the US President of that time, Gerald Ford, and the Canadian Prime Minister of that time, Pierre Trudeau, signed the final protocol or final act of the um, Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, informally known as the Helsinki Accords, whereby the signatories promised to respect the European borders at that time, while allowing the European countries at that time to peacefully change their borders, as indeed then happened starting in 1990 when the two Germanys reunited peacefully. And then Yugoslavia broke up, but that sparked a series of civil wars. The Soviet Union broke up also somewhat violently, while Czechoslovakia peacefully split up into the Czech Republic and Slovakia in January 1993. But in any case, then they promised those signatories whose countries were members of the US-led North American Treaty Organization and of the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact promised to notify each other if, within a 250-kilometer border zone, they held military exercises. And they also promised to respect democracy and human rights, although to the east of the Iron Curtain in Europe, the last provision remained largely a dead letter until Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet dictator, cautiously began his reforms in 1985, which eventually led to the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 and to that country's partial democratization before the breakup. Interestingly enough, the Yom Kippur War also took place during the Muslim fasting month of Ramadan, when the religious Muslims are only allowed to eat between sunset and sunrise. And then at one point, the United States and the Soviet Union came close to the brink of a military conflict because they were ready to send fighter airplanes to the Middle East. But fortunately, by the good Lord's grace, World War III and the nuclear war did not yet start at the time. And many Bible-believing Christians around the world, and also probably many religious Jews and Muslims, among others, saw that as a divine intervention. So at the end of December 1973, the delayed Israeli parliamentary or Knesset elections took place. The Labor alignment lost 5 or 6 seats compared to the 1969 elections, while the right-wing coalition Likud rose to 39 seats. So with the Labor alignment having 51 seats and the minor parties having the remaining 30 seats. So Golda Meir was still able to form a government after difficult negotiations, but as I said, she left office suffering that political fallout, or major portion of it, by June 1974. US President Richard Nixon at first was reluctant to send material aid and military aid to Israel, not least because he was already burdened by the Watergate scandal, which would lead to his ignoble resignation in August 1974. But eventually, under pressure, he agreed to open a so-called air bridge between the United States and Israel. On October the 22nd, 1973, the United Nations Security Council, where both the Soviet Union and the United States were represented, and until now, Russia, the largest former Soviet republic, is represented there, adopted Resolution 338, which demanded an immediate end to the fighting. Israel signed a formal ceasefire agreement with Egypt on November the 11th, 1973, and with Syria on May the 31st, 1974. Although the war did not immediately alter the dynamics of the Arab-Israeli conflict, it did cause, indirectly, Egypt to recognize Israel as an independent country instead of using that pejorative, deeply negative term, the Zionist entity. But the war was costly for all the three countries that were directly involved. So that was from Encyclopedia Britannica. Then from another website, a tourism website, the Golan Heights, a border region between northeastern Israel and southwestern Syria, have, according to this website, today 32 villages, flourishing agriculture, that is farms, a wealth of nature, and a treasure trove of tourist sites. Security above from the website www.i24 or uh, www.i24news.tv. Security above all else, Israeli Defense Forces or Israeli Army Chief marks 50 years since Yom Kippur War, published on September the 12th, 2023. Israel's Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi on Monday, September the 11th, 1970, September the 11th, 2023, marked the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War with a speech to an assembly of the Israeli Defense Forces, asserting that when the Jewish state or Israel is threatened, its army knows how to mobilize all its resources. He furthermore stated, "We must address every statement of our enemies in words or actions." He went on, "Our enemies may be tempted to see an advantage in the multi aspect threat. To us, it is better for them to know that when Israel is threatened, it knows how to mobilize all its resources, put the differences aside, and attack. So it was in the Yom Kippur War required to do so." More recently, social unrest over the controversial judicial reform of the right wing current Israeli government, led by the longtime Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which has given the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, to override by a simple majority the decisions of the Israeli Supreme Court in order to allegedly depoliticize those decisions, at least to some extent. And the only way in which the Israeli Supreme Court can retaliate, cancel those cancellations of its decisions, is by repassing them with a 3/4 majority, that is 12 of the 15 judges agreeing. No, 4/5 majority, sorry. 4/5 majority, 12 of the 15 judges of the Israeli Supreme Court have to agree to cancel them. So this social unrest with multiple weekend demonstrations has led to speculation that the Israeli army's capabilities have been hindered or uh, prevented, despite top political and security officials assuring otherwise. Halevi concluded in his speech, "It is impossible not to wonder, can such cohesion only exist given such a great threat?" In other words, the threat of Arab invasion and, of course, the threat of Palestinian terrorists or other Arab terrorists invading Israel inside its territory. The state of Israel has one Israeli Defense Force or forces that protects it from many enemies. It is the responsibility of all of us to protect it because it is the basis of our safe existence here and because our security is above all else. Reflections on 50 years since the Yom Kippur War. 1973, according to this website, www.jw3.org.uk, brought a shocking war which nearly led Israel to an unexpected defeat. This led to many questions being asked by military and non-military as to the direction Israel was taking. Okay, it's more like the introduction to a broadcast. And then finally, from the History Channel website, www.history.com. Israel's stunning victory in the Six-Day War of June 1967 had quadrupled or multiplied by 4 times the territory that Israel held. Egypt had lost the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip all the way up to the eastern shore of the Suez Canal, which is the man-made border between Africa in the west and Asia in the east. Jordan had lost the west bank of the Jordan River, and the Kingdom of Jordan, had lost that area, and of course East Jerusalem. And Syria had lost the strategically important Golan Heights. And Egypt was considered a weak nation after its disastrous defeat in the Six-Day War. President El Sadat recognized this and wanted to negotiate with the Israelis so as to get back the Sinai Peninsula. In 1972, Sadat expelled 20,000 Soviet advisors from Egypt and started to approach the United States, which, as we know, was and still remains the most powerful human ally in terms of the world's countries of Israel. And then the United States, of course, would be an essential mediator in any future peace negotiations. And El Sadat formed a new alliance with Syria and planned that attack. And because it was the Day of Atonement, many of Israel's soldiers were away from their posts, either inside their homes or then in the synagogues or Jewish places of worship. Iraqi forces soon joined the war. Syria received support from Jordan. But several days after the war had begun, Israel was fully mobilized and started to push the Egyptian and Syrian forces back. In 1979, Syria retaliated by voting with other Arab states to expel Egypt from the Arab League, to which Egypt would be readmitted only in 1989. And finally, then, from the Wikipedia article, so after concluding the Camp David peace accords with Israel in 1978 and 1979, Egypt drifted further away from its earlier warm relations with the Soviet Union and eventually left the Soviet sphere of influence completely. So on that fateful morning of October the 6th, 1973, just several hours before the joint Egyptian-Syrian invasion of Israel began, Prime Minister Meir decided that Israel would not make a preemptive strike, but instead would just call 100,000 of its reserve soldiers into action, because otherwise Israel could expect no help from its American allies. According to future director of the Central Intelligence Agency and Defense Secretary Robert Gates, he was actually briefing an American arms negotiator, claiming that it would be improbable for an armed conflict to break out around that time in the Middle East, when he received the stunning news that such a conflict had just begun. So on the Sinai front, according to this Wikipedia article, the Egyptians had prepared for an assault across the Suez Canal and deployed 5 divisions with a total of 100,000 soldiers, 1,350 tanks, and 2,000 guns and heavy mortars for the onslaught. Facing them were just 450 soldiers of the Jerusalem Brigade. There were 290 Israeli tanks in all of Sinai, divided into 3 armored brigades. And only one of those brigades was deployed near the Suez Canal when the hostilities surprisingly began. And eventually, the Israeli forces were able to cross the Suez Canal and secure the bridgehead. And Egypt's Third Army was trapped. On the Golan Heights, some 3,000 Israeli soldiers, 180 tanks, and 60 artillery pieces were facing off approximately 28,000 Syrian soldiers, 800 tanks, and 600 artillery pieces. And the Syrians even deployed 2 armored divisions from the second day onwards. So temporarily, the Syrians were able to break through the Israeli lines in the southern Golan, but then Israel fought back, despite the fact that its 188th armored brigade had collapsed, and then Israel reconquered the southern Golan. And there were naval operations. The Battle of Baltim, from October the 8th to 9th, off the coast of Baltim and Damietta, ended in a decisive Israeli victory. And then there was, a US-Soviet naval standoff. And that brought the 2 superpowers to the brink of World War III, but fortunately that did not happen. And on October the 24th, 1973, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 339, serving as a renewed demand that all fighting stop. On October the 25th, 1973, the US Secretary of State or Foreign Minister Henry Kissinger appeared before the press at the State Department. He stated, for example, our position is that the conditions that produced this war were clearly intolerable to the Arab nations, and that in the process of negotiations, it will be necessary to make substantial concessions. The problem will be to relate the Arab concern for the sovereignty over the territories to the Israeli concern for secure boundaries. We believe that the process of negotiations between the parties is an essential component of this. Okay, this then concludes this video. And may God have mercy on Israel, the Arab nations, and on the rest of the humankind of the earth. Bye bye for the time being.